Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the United Nations Children Fund, I would like to welcome you to the launch of the International Classification of Violence Against Children. My name is Claudia Cappa, and I'm a senior advisor in the Data and Analytics section of UNICEF based in New York. It's my great pleasure and honor to open this webinar to present the International Classification of Violence Against Children. It is our distinguished pleasure to be joined today by a number of distinguished panelists, and I also want to thank you for having joined this morning. First, we are going to be joined by Pablo Espinella, who is Senior Special Assistant and Chief of Staff in the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children. Pablo is here representing the Special Representative on Violence Against Children. Thank you so much, Pablo, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm also equally pleased to be joined by Stephen Blight, who is Senior Advisor in the program team responsible for violence against children in UNICEF headquarters. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us today. Following the presentation of the International Classification of Violence Against Children, we are going to open for a panel discussion. We are going to be hearing from Francesca Groom, who is Assistant Director-in-Chief in the Demographic and Social Statistics branch at the United Nations Statistics Division. Thank you, Francesca, for being with us today. We're also honored to have Angela May, who is Chief of the Research and Trends Analysis branch at the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime. And then last but not least, we are going to have Howard Taylor, Executive Director of the End Violence Partnership. Thank you so much, Howard, for giving us the honor of joining us today. And for the closing remarks, we are going to count on João Pedro Azevedo, who is Chief Statistician and Deputy Director in the Data and Analytics section of UNICEF in New York. Without further ado, I would like to start the official presentation of the International Classification of Violence Against Children. And let me start by mentioning why UNICEF decided, together with over 200 experts, to develop the International Classification of Violence Against Children. It was developed in response to the need to have a comprehensive operational definition of violence against children, together with a statistical code book of all forms of violence against children. In 2018, UNICEF gathered over 40 national statistical offices across the world. We came together to discuss data availability and data gaps. UNICEF, as custodian agency for the SDG indicators related to violence against children, convened the experts in an attempt to understand what we can do together to improve the availability and quality of data on violence against children. What came out from the discussion is the clear recognition that countries were confused because multiple definitions of violence against children existed and were used to determine the scope of the data collection. These differences in definitions were not only affecting the comparability of statistics across countries, they were also producing conflicting numbers at the country level, depending on the data sources and actors responsible for gathering the data. Also, we realized that while certain particularly severe forms of violence against children were captured in the legislation, but also in the data collection, like, for example, homicides of children or rape, other less severe forms of violence, but equally damaging and also very widespread, were not regulated or captured in the legislation nor in the statistical infrastructure of the different countries. Just an example of this gap, data related to neglect. And we know that all forms of violence against children, no matter the frequency or severity, have detrimental impacts on the child's physical, emotional, and spiritual development. In response to the need for operational definition of violence against children, UNICEF decided to bring together experts from across the world in an effort to produce definition of violence against children that can be used for statistical purposes. And we decided to build an international classification done inconsistent with other international classification already existing. In particular, we built the International Classification of Violence Against Children inconsistent with the International Classification of Crime for Statistical Purposes, or ICCS, that was developed and is under the leadership of UNODC. And we are particularly grateful to the UNODC team for the continuous support and assistance provided throughout the development of the ICVAC. It was very important for us to partner with UNODC and the fantastic team to make sure that these two classifications speak to each other and are harmonized. And in the development of the classification, we also closely followed the principles that were put together by the United Nations Statistics Division for the drafting of international classification. And here again, I want to take a moment to acknowledge great support and collaboration with the United Nations Statistics Division team, who was fundamental to the successful development of the International Classification of Violence Against Children. Just a quick overview of the process. As I mentioned, we started with this consultation in 2018. We then decided to produce a first draft of the classification that was submitted for review. A review that brought together about 50 different experts in the first step. And this first process of drafting and review lasted between 2019 and 2022. Then in 2022, we embarked in an extended consultation that brought together over 200 experts, including representatives from national statistical offices, government institutions, the academia, civil society, international organizations. So this consultation process took few months since April to October 2022. In October, the draft international classification was reviewed by the expert group that has been created with the mandate to review and regulate the adoption and implementation of statistical classifications across the world. Following the review and approval from a group of experts, the International Classification of Violence Against Children underwent a multi-country pilot test that saw the participation of various countries. And this pilot was done to check the country's ability to produce data on the different forms of violence against children that are regulated by ICVAC, verify what countries had already collected in terms of the latest available data, any discrepancy between the national definitions and the ICVAC definition, but this pilot was an opportunity to understand whether specific obstacles were in existence in countries when it comes to affecting the production of data. So this country pilot took place between December 2022 and February 2023. Following this pilot, the International Classification of Violence Against Children was presented and discussed at the 54th session of the United Nations Statistical Commission. The United Nations Statistical Commission has been in operation since 1947 and brings together the chief statistician of countries across the world. It is the biggest statistical body with authority for approval of international statistical standards. It was with great pleasure that we participated in the debate that took place at the Statistical Commission, where the International Classification of Violence Against Children was endorsed and recommended for inclusion in the international family of statistical classification. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes acknowledging the vast expertise and diversity of all those who join hands with UNICEF in producing the International Classification of Violence Against Children. The core drafting team included, beyond myself, Roberta Cecchetti, who is an international expert on child protection and safeguarding. We also were delighted to count on the expertise and passion of Isabelle Hihon, who is a sociologist of childhood and a child protection specialist. But as I mentioned earlier, those who collaborated to the preparation and the drafting of the International Classification of Violence Against Children includes over 200 experts, including representatives for 43 national statistical offices, going from Albania to Belarus to Burundi, Canada, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, Turkmenistan, United Kingdom, Sierra Leone, Turkey, and so on and so forth. And we were, again, extremely grateful to the national statistical offices who were involved in the drafting and the testing of the international classification. I also want to take a moment to also acknowledge 15 government agencies, again, that were involved in the drafting and the testing of the statistical classification, and 15 academic institutions, again, ranging from institutions based in Austria to Canada, to Germany, to Turkey. We had three civil society organizations, 7 international organizations, and 3 additional organizations. So again, it's my way of saying thank you on behalf of UNICEF for your dedication and commitment to the successful development and implementation of the ICVAC. And this has not been an easy process, and we didn't expect this to be an easy process. Why? Because we were trying to regulate something that for most part still remain unregulated. And what I mean by that is that in many cases, we were confronted with discussing issues for which we do not have clear cutoff definitions, hence the need for us to jump in, of course, but also regulate things that and behaviors and acts that are still, for which still research and evidence remain lacking. So how did we go about developing the statistical classification, and what is the final definition of violence that we landed on after these 5 years of consultation? Violence is defined after this process of consultation as any deliberate, unwanted, and non-essential act, threatened or actual, against a child or multiple children, that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in death, injury, or other forms of physical and psychological suffering. Let me try now to unpack a little bit this definition. So first of all, the unit of classification we are using to identify violence is the act. There has to be an act that is committed. And I wanted to pause for a second to highlight why the choice of the act was done within the context of the ICVAC. Focusing on an act that can be verbal, that can be physical, that can be sexual, can be non-verbal, is important because allows to eliminate elements that might be very much dependent on sociocultural and legal background. Like, for instance, the definition based on, for instance, the motivation or crime, the definition of a crime. So we focus on acts, not on motivations, not on the victim per se. And the acts can be single acts or repeated acts, including acts of omission. And this is important when it comes to defining, for example, neglect. And I'll come back to this in a second. The International Classification of Violence Against Children regulate interpersonal violence, so which is a violence that is committed against one child or multiple children by another person. we also cover collective acts. So individual and group violence. For an act to be classified as an act of violence, the act has to have 4 concurrent characteristics. It has to be deliberate, unwanted, non-essential, and harmful. So what does it mean, a deliberate act? So this does not refer to the intention to harm. This is not a criteria for the International Classification of Violence Against Children. So whether or not harm is intended, it is not a core criteria for defining an act as an act of violence. But the act needs to be deliberate. So the action in itself needs to be intended, cannot be the result of an accident, for example. The act needs to be unwanted by the victim. And unwanted, of course, is a concept that was particularly complex to regulate. Unwanted take into consideration the age and evolving capacity of children, but also the fact that certain children, because of a number of different characteristics, might not be able to agree or disagree to a certain act. The act needs to be non-essential, meaning not motivated by reasons of survival of the child or fitness. And an act needs to be harmful to the child. And harm is defined not only in terms of physical harm, but also psychological harm and long-term harm, as well as immediate harm. So just to give you examples of how these criteria, these concurrent characteristics, are relevant for the definition of violence, let's take the example of a child who is hit by a parent who fall and inadvertently hit the child in the process of falling. In this case, there is, of course, an act that is harmful because it might result in pain and sufferings and an injury possibly to the child. It's not something that is wanted by the child. This act is non-essential, but it's not a deliberate act because the parent did not intend to fall. So, of course, we can also have an act that is deliberate, unwanted, harmful, but it is essential. For example, in the case of a medical procedure where the physical force is used, it's not wanted by the child, it can be harmful because it might, for instance, result in pain and suffering of the victim, but that act is essential, for instance, for the survival of the child. Or in a case, for example, where there is resuscitation of the child or force feeding of the child, because otherwise the life of the child is under threat. So by the combination of these 4 elements, which we use building on a framework that was developed by Sherry Hamby, an academic that we had the pleasure of work with, an act can be really classified as an act of violence. And of course, when the act is perpetrated against somebody who is below the age of 18, it becomes an act of violence against a child. On the basis of this principle, then, we organize the different acts of violence depending on the nature of the act. And we came up with 5 main level 1 categories: homicide of a child, physical violence against a child, sexual violence against a child, psychological violence against a child, neglect of a child. And last, we had to include, according to the principle of international classification, a catch-all category called category number 9, that is meant to capture other acts of violence that are not elsewhere classified in the other different categories. For each one of this level 1 category, we provided a very specific definition that incorporates the 4 elements that I explained earlier and make it specific in light of the nature of the violent acts. And I want to give just an example of how this definition were operationalized. And I want to give the example of neglect of a child. It was particularly complex to define and regulate. Because again, the same reason I mentioned earlier, there is still a lot of research that is evolving, understanding, that are culturally determined, etc. So after long research and deliberation, we landed on the following definition of neglect. Neglect refers to the deliberate, unwanted, and non-essential failure to meet a child's physical or psychological needs, protect the child from danger, or obtain medical, educational, and other services when those responsible for the child care have the means, knowledge, and access to services to do so. It is a complex definition because when it comes to neglect, we really need to emphasize the element of the intention. We did not want, for instance, to penalize circumstances and situations and acts that are, for instance, depriving a child from accessing education because the parents or the child caregivers do not have the means, the knowledge, or the access to services to allow to ensure that the child has access to education. So we really had to unpack in the definition for neglect these elements of deliberate. And also it's important that in the case of neglect, we were regulating acts of omission. Is the not doing something, not providing the child with the care and access to services that the child needs to be able to grow and thrive. Of course, all these definitions, the rationale, the principle, and the research and literature used to come up with this definition will be included and is included in the draft, in the text of the International Classification of Violence Against Children. Now, moving on into giving you a quick overview of how then we go from these big categories into subgroups. This is a quick outlook, the way in which the statistical classification is organized. For each one of the 5 main categories, then there are subcategories that have been created, and the subcategories provide examples. They are essentially taxonomies. They illustrate what are the concrete acts of violence that fall into the different categories. And for each one of these different subcategories, we provide examples of acts, but also exclusion, meaning things that might be thought as belonging to the subcategory, but they actually don't belong. And also, it's important to recognize that according to the principle of the international classification in general, an act can only be classified under one category only because of the principle of exclusivity. So the classification allows to identify the groupings where the different acts belong and provide guidance on how to classify. Of course, this was also done with the understanding that we expect to continue to be working on this classification for many years to come. Because one of the things that will need to be done is constantly updating the statistical classification with new manifestation of violence against children that might emerge. An important chapter in the classification also regulates the variables that needs to be used to disaggregate information on the different acts. This disaggregation is critical because at times this disaggregation is a core element to the definition. For instance, age of the victim is critical to be captured in survey or administrative data. Why? Because not knowing the age of the victim prevents us from being able to classify an act of violence as an act of violence against a child or an adult. And in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a child is defined as anyone below the age of 18. But other variables are also important to collect through household survey, school-based survey, or administrative records to be able to have basic information on the circumstances surrounding the occurrence of a violent act. And this information is critical to understand from the programmatic and policy perspective what are the entry points for the prevention of violence against children. And of course, there are additional variables that are particularly important when we want to have a more in-depth understanding of how, why violence occurs. So we take all the different interesting and relevant variables for disaggregation, and we organize them and classify them according to tiers. Because we understand that there is a tremendous burden at times placed on those responsible for data collection. So the more things we ask data producers to collect has implication on the frequency, the cost, the feasibility of the data collection. So we organize these variables for disaggregation into tiers to acknowledge that countries will need to adjust gradually depending on their capacity and resources, and then collect these different variables depending on the level of maturity and the resources available at the country level. But some of the background characteristics that we flag as relevant for the collection of data refers to, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the age of the victim, the age of the perpetrator, the gender of the perpetrator and the victim, but also other characteristics of the victim, for example, previous victimization history, and whether the child has experienced different forms of violence. When it comes to the perpetrator, we also included variables such as previous history of violence, for example, and whether the perpetrator belongs to a group or is an individual. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge that we included as variable for the perpetrator institutional linkages to see if the perpetrator is actually connected to an institution, because we wanted to be able to acknowledge the existence of state violence, for example, and allow for countries that have the capacity to do so to also gather information that allow for the identification of violence acts that belong to state violence. I'm going to conclude by giving you some ideas about the implementation plans, because the statistical classification and its release, it's the beginning of a process. Of course, is an end in itself because it's the end of these 5 years of consultation, but it's also the beginning of a phase where UNICEF looks forward to working with partners, such as, for instance, international organizations, but also, and most importantly, country-level partners for the successful implementation and rollout of the statistical classification at the country level. The international classification of violence is a public good. And this public good is going to be effective in strengthening the availability of and quality of data on violence against children only if we continue to join hands in transferring this tool and integrating this tool into the national statistical plans of country. UNICEF stands ready to continue to work with national statistical authorities, government entities, and other stakeholders to support the implementation. The ICVAC will be officially released on Monday, June 26. All of you participating in this webinar, together with all those who contributed with the ICVAC and our extended network, will receive an email. In that email, you will have the webinar recording, the PowerPoint presentation, a video about the international classification of violence against children, and you will also receive the PDF of the International Classification of Violence Against Children, which will also be available on data.unicef.org. To support its implementation, UNICEF will be developing a number of tools and guidance to support the country uptake, including, for instance, a tool to assess the existence at the national level of definition and identify gaps and need against these definitions versus the ICVAC. We're also going to be develop implementation action plan and template, a manual on how to integrate the ICVAC, but also actual tools for administrative records, for household surveys that will allow country to collect the data in a way that is consistent with the international classification. And to accompany the implementation and uptake of the tool, we are going to develop a mechanism of technical assistance that will be rolled out together with capacity building webinars and in-person trainings across the 7 different regions where UNICEF operates. I'm going to stop here. I will be, of course, delighted to answer any question you might have. And thank you again to all those who joined and all those who dedicated their expertise and time to working on the statistical classification of violence against children. It is my hope that through these collective efforts, we will be a step closer towards the world ambition of ending violence against children once and for all. Thank you so much. And then it's my great pleasure now to give the floor to Pablo for some remarks. And then, of course, we can open the panel. Thank you so much. And over to you, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you so much, Pablo.
So thank you very much, and I'm very happy and delighted to be with you on behalf of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children in this important global webinar that comes in a moment where the multiple crises and the interconnected crises we are seeing around the world with the new drivers of violence and the new forms of violence are making our goal of ending violence by 2030 more difficult. So the robust data and the research that we require are essential for better understanding the challenges we are facing to prevent and respond to violence against children. And the solid data is key for effective planning and policy making, as well as allocation of adequate technical and financial resources. As you know, from the Office of the Special Representative, the investment case, as we are working very closely with UNICEF and partners, is critical. And to move ahead on the investment case, we need to have this robust data. So until now, this data has been a little bit scattered, fragmented, and we lack the international agreed definitions and methodology for the collection and analysis of this data. So we are very pleased of this important effort that it has been taken by this multi-stakeholder group, in particular under the leadership of UNICEF, to really ensure that we have this set of classifications that, of course, as Claudia, you have said, is not perfect, and it will need to be looked at as we advance on the implementation, but it's a very important step ahead. And I think having a set of specific SDG targets to end violence against children in the 2030 agenda I referred has really focused to have these kind of indicators that will give us much more direction on what is the focus we need to put to end violence and to ensure that we have this comprehensive approach of having violence against children, look at it from a perspective where it affects all the 17 SDGs and not only focus on one, but seeing all the connectivities as well as the continuum of violence. So I think that in March, the endorsement by the UN Statistical Commission of the International Classification of Violence Against Children has been a major breakthrough, and that from the Office of the SRSG we really appreciate because it will help all of us working together to continue advancing on this direction. And I think this strong international technical collaboration is giving us this set of standards definitions, which of course we will need to see how they are going to be applied as we implement, as you, Claudia, were saying, when we look at it with the countries, we are closely working in pushing their engagement and their commitment to end violence. So what I think from our side, we really need, and we are ready to help and to support from the Office of the Special Representative to ensure that the states and the stakeholders who are to collect this data are familiar with those definitions, but also that we work together to see whether those definitions actually make sense when they are being applied, because as we applied all this framework, we will need to really see how this actually is implementable, and what are the adjustments that you, Claudia, say that will need to be done, because that will make us, as you say, the work, it doesn't stop with the launching of this set with this framework, but it will require to really work together to ensure that this actually have a meaning on the elements that we need to really ensure that the policies, the practices that they are being implemented actually address all the challenges we are seeing. So from the Office of the SRSG, we really appreciate the collecting of this high quality data is essential. It's an important first step. It will require this validity that is always important in terms of all these complexities that we have. And I think the effort by UNICEF and by all the stakeholders that have been involved in this process, it really makes the difference of having all the different sectors and having the comprehensive approach. We really need to overcome the frequent disconnect between the data and action, between action and the real problems that we face, and between the statistical offices and other government departments that gather and analyze data and the policymakers who use it. And I think that this very strong framework will put that stone in the path to really ensure that that this is followed very closely. One important point, as you know, from our office is the integration and the ensuring that children are involved in these processes, but also on the analysis of the data and of the use of the data, because they are the main advocates for evidence-based action to end violence when they are listened. And in this context, we again, we stand ready to support the countries and the UNICEF offices and all the partners in the civil society organizations that they are working at the country level to support them in this direction. So in closing, we would like to stress that the call for increased technical and financial resources for the protection of children, it will be more effectively addressed when we have this sound and strong and evidence-based data that will be possible thanks to this new framework. And the international standards that you are presenting today, the framework that you are presenting today, and they will be launched the 26th, is clearly making a robust pillar again to support the advocacy that we are trying, all of us jointly, to make of the importance of investment on ending violence, both because the cost of violence is huge, but also because the return on investments when we are addressing all the violence against children in a comprehensive way have high returns. So thank you very much, and thank you on behalf of the SRSC.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for your opening remarks, which set out the importance of the ICVAC in the context of the 2030 agenda. I think you made the case well that, that we need such robust data in order to build the investment case necessary for financing of efforts to end violence against children. I think you made some great points about the need to going beyond just our work with national statisticians and to work with national policy makers as well. And you highlighted as well the importance of engaging children as part of national plans towards the elimination of violence against children. So once again, I'm Stephen Blight, and I oversee UNICEF's programs to address violence against children at global level. And I must say that we are really excited now. We're really excited that we have an international statistical standard on violence against children. So this means that countries now have a tool to assess the extent to which their national definitions comply with internationally agreed standards. And it means we'll be able to collect data using common definitions on the various forms of violence. And this will result in comparable data within countries and across countries. And all of this has not been possible before. All of this has not been possible before. And ultimately, it means that we're going to have better quality data to improve policies and programs to improve the lives of children worldwide. However, as Claudia pointed out in concluding her remarks, this is not the end of a long road, but this is just the beginning. With the inclusion of the ICVAC within the international family of classifications, we now need to focus our efforts on making sure the classification is implemented. We need to focus on implementation now. And for this reason, we've pulled together a panel representing the range of stakeholders that have a role to play in supporting implementation of the classification. But before going on to the panel, I just wanted to, I see all sorts of great comments, great questions in the chat. I just want to direct your attention to the Q&A function in the Zoom platform, and we'll endeavor to try and respond to each of those questions in the Q&A. And depending on time, we'll might be able to come back and take a few questions directly online. So first of all, on our panel, we have Francesca Groom from the UN Statistics Division. Francesca, welcome to the panel. And I understand at the UN Statistical Division, you're involved in monitoring SDGs related to the eradication of all forms of violence against women and girls. And we'd really like to learn from you. What are the challenges from these efforts that could inform or guide the implementation of the ICVAC? Over to you, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thanks, Claudia, for inviting the United Nations Statistics Division to this important discussion. Let me start with some general remarks on the importance of having a statistical classification on violence against children that has been recognized as an international standard by the UN Statistical Commission. So having such classification, the ICVAC, accompanied by detailed guidelines and manuals for its implementation, is a critical element and a major step towards the standardization of concepts, definitions, methods, and data related to violence against children at the country level. And we know that this will also result in data harmonization at the global level. I would also like to stress, as Claudia pointed out a few minutes ago, that the development of such a classification as an international statistical standard is not a trivial process, and UNICEF should really be congratulated for achieving this milestone. Getting to the adoption of the classification involved several discussions with experts, inclusive consultation processes with data compilers, data users, and other stakeholders from countries and international entities. So you can imagine the level of consultations and the intense verifications that took place over the last few years. It also involved working closely with the UN Committee of Experts on International Statistical Classifications, and I like to stress that these are experts on classifications for statistical purposes. And this group of experts reviewed and assessed the classification against several standard criteria and principles that all international statistical classifications need to satisfy. So the classification went through a thorough verification process, and again, a big chapeau to UNICEF for all the efforts to achieve this point. Let me now switch to some points I like to make based on the experience that we gain collectively, UNSD, together with the many partners that are with us today, of course, UNICEF, UNODC, WHO, and others, over almost 20 years of developing and fine-tuning the methods to measure violence against women and girls. So I'm switching to women and girls, knowing that there is also an overlap with children, of course. And also because we believe that a lot of lessons learned have been gained over the last 20 years that could guide the next steps as we move from this conceptual framework, the International Statistical Classification, towards the implementation of this framework and guiding principles that have been agreed so far. So it was pointed out by several of the speakers before that this is where we stand. We really want to assist countries in their efforts to implement in using this classification and in producing robust data. The classification itself is a guiding conceptual framework. It gives us the key concepts, the operational definitions for the production of statistics on violence against children, as well as, and this is important, the structure to organize this data across different data sources. But the classification itself does not tell us how to do it. And so it was very good to hear from Claudia that there are already implementation plans. So what did we learn over almost 20 years of measuring and fine-tuning the production of data on violence against women and girls? Well, first we learned that this is not easy. It's a very challenging operation. It relies on complex data collections. It's a sensitive topic that requires special solutions and measures. We know that we need to have from the beginning a very strong political will and leadership at all levels, both among the data producers as well as among the data users. Many countries actually have specific requirements for collection of data on violence against women and girls in their national statistical legislation to make sure that if there is a shift in power, the law is there to ensure that this data will still be measured, will still be produced, and violence against women and girls will still be measured and monitored. There is also a need for continuous training of interviewers and statisticians, because measuring violence against women and girls, and in this case, violence against children, is not business as usual within national statistical offices and national statistical systems. And this comes at a cost. So we also need to plan and to secure proper resources to, again, make sure that this is not a one-time data collection effort, but in fact, we have proper plans to make sure that this can be, these topics can be measured and monitored on a regular basis. As we strive to pull together data from different sources, could be household surveys, could be administrative records, police records, data produced by the judiciary system. We also need to ensure proper collaboration among the many data producers at the country level. And of course, we also need to ensure that there is some way for establishing a data sharing and data access while also promoting the use of same concepts and same definitions and methods. And on this last point, having an international statistical classification will definitely help. What we learned over 20 years of measuring violence against women is that the data comparability is still an issue, both across countries, so when we compare internationally, but also within countries. And that's mainly due to the fact that different data sources have been used and also methodologies, survey methodologies have shifted over time. So this is another key element that should be kept in mind as we move into the implementation and the data collection in all countries of data on violence against children. Of course, for measuring violence against women and girls, having a United Nations guidelines for producing statistics on violence against women was fundamental. This publication is a little oldish, so we are planning to update it soon. But the beauty of this publication was that it was produced together with many stakeholders. All the international statistical community backed up this product, and it really gives, it provides the steps that national statistical offices should follow. So it's like a cookbook on how to produce statistics on violence against women according to the latest standards. But to conclude, and as we look forward to the next steps, now that we have an adopted international statistical classification on violence against children, and also based on what we learned from working on statistics on violence against women, I think it will be important to invest on such operational guidance, a similar cookbook for countries really to know how to move from the classification, the theoretical conceptual framework, to the production of policy relevant, high quality, granular data on violence against children. We should also plan for and secure resources for capacity building. I believe the speakers before me mentioned that too. So that's something that's very important. Making sure that countries are able to build a sustainable and integrated statistical information system. So we are really trying to move away from ad hoc data collections and instead assist countries in their efforts to plan properly the collection of violence against children in the context of the collection of related topics, right? And in a way that is integrated so that the different data sources are talking to each other and are and we are able to pool the different bits and pieces of the information together in an harmonized way. A third point is that we should also continue to consistently promote the alignment and the consistency between related classifications, not just conceptually. I think this is a great job. This happened already, and again, chapeau to UNICEF, but not just at the conceptual level, but also at the operational level, so that once all together we put together this solution, these common data collection tools, like model questionnaires or other solutions, we also keep in mind that countries may want to collect the data on violence against children, but this also needs to be aligned with what we promote, for example, when we measure violence against women/girls, because there is also an overlap there. And finally, we should already plan for regular updates of the classification of violence against children. I mean, I know it was just adopted a few months ago in March 2023, But as with all statistical classifications, the classification on the ICVAC should not be viewed as static, but rather as a starting point to ensure that the classification remains relevant. And of course, the implementation phase of the classification will be essential to provide feedback for its future improvements. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Francesca. And really, I just wanted to acknowledge the role of the UN Statistics Division in supporting the ICVAC. The UN Statistics Division, really has a key role in advancing the global statistical system and developing norms and standards such as the ICVAC and providing that support to national statistical offices. And of course, there's a wealth of experience in other domains, such as the area of violence against women and girls that we can learn from in implementing the ICVAC. So thanks once again, Francesca, for your guidance. Next on the panel, we have Selim Gürbüz from the Turkish Statistical Institute. And now the Turkish Statistical Institute has done some pilot testing of the ICVAC. So Selim, I wonder if you could tell us what was your experience in coordinating the different entities in Turkey for testing of the ICVAC, and what are some of the lessons learned from this this process? Over to you, Selim.
Mr. Blight, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes, so let the show begins. Good afternoon from Turkey and good afternoon from Ankara. Before beginning my section, I would kindly request you to excuse my excitement. Sometimes I may need to look at my notes so as not to miss some explanations, especially on technical issues. At first, I would like to express my gratitude to my team, to my directors, to Ms. Kappa, and to her distinguished colleagues, our internal stakeholders, especially culture and justice statistics, our external stakeholders, especially DG Criminal Records and Statistics, Ankara Bar Associations and UNICEF Turkey regarding this opportunity and experience. It was a great pleasure for us to work with you and with all distinguished colleagues, and I am really sure it is going to be in the future. If you do not mind, let me introduce myself in brief. I have been working in Turkstat at 22 years, for 22 years, and worked at several different domains such as science and technology statistics, gender statistics. From 2020 onwards, I've been working as head of classification group. Briefly, my group is in charge with to determine all international statistical classifications to be used in social and economic statistics, to adapt them to country-specific conditions, to prepare corresponding tables, and so on. Now, I am going to mention the process between us and UNICEF in three phases. The first phase was about the global consultation at the beginning of May 2022. We consolidate all the responses from our related organizations and institutions and sent them to UNICEF at the end of May 2022. And in addition to this document, we also prepared a comment regarding type of violence in Excel file. Afterwards, the second phase of the process is at the beginning of October. We participated in webinar, and also UNICEF allocated us simultaneous translation in Turkish. We also would kindly ask to UNICEF to prepare ICVAC manual and related documents in Turkish as well. Finally, the third and last phase of the relationship between UNICEF is being a volunteer country regarding pilot test. As everyone already know, at February the 6th of 2023, we had a disaster And although this dramatic event slowed down on our organizational process, Turkcell sent a related table and pilot project report to UNICEF on February 21. In terms of lessons we learned during both the global consultation and pilot study, I would like to express the following. We have observed the administrative records are very important for ICVAC. It was possible to study on homicide, physical violence, sexual violence, and neglect through the ICCS and Turkish Penal Code correspondence table. We have determined that matching the law with the action will be even more important in the future. I can say the most problematic area is psychological violence. The survey is required for this because from our point of view, psychological violence is the most psychological violence cannot be measured very well. Negligence is also problematic in this regard, but at least in the Turkish Penal Code, there's a title that regulates negligence as breach of obligations conferred upon by family law. One of the other important lessons learned is that it is absolutely necessary to get consultancy from a penal law expert regarding the terminological or conceptual dimension. Due to the differences in the responsibilities and areas of expertise of the institutions, and awareness meeting is also important to ensure the unity of definition, to inform and brainstorm about the manual, correspondence tables, and classification index. It is intended to plan this organization in 2024 with UNICEF Turkey. In this respect, we look forward to the final version of the manual, classification index, and correspondence tables. Additionally, it was observed that effective coordination between task forces or teams is essential to create synergy. An email group can be set up as well as an ICVAC specific portal. A forum page should definitely be established and discussions should be conducted there. We have no doubt that the value of the forum will be appreciated, especially during the fieldwork phase. Throughout the process, we realized that the ministries of family, education, and health should definitely be involved in the ICVAC work. Since the statistical unity's action or behavior, the role of this institution is better understood when the conceptual dimension of the issue and the public health dimension are considered. Especially in the pilot project, we observed that the main data source for us in the administrative records are the DG Security and the General Command of Gendarmerie. Moreover, we also observed the crucial role of DG Criminal Records and Statistics. It's an important part of the statistical system in producing official statistics on justice statistics. For some statistics, such as prison statistics, data are compiled from the database in the Nation Judicial Network Information System, which is called UYAP in Turkey. When our Ministry of Interior have been working on a data center, which is called Internal Affairs Data Center. When this project carried out, access to graphical reports such as incidents, judicial proceedings, capture and seizure, regulatory preventive action, and etc. will be provided. Unfortunately, data couldn't be shared as it was not possible to check and consistency analysis of data from the field in a time restriction. Institutions refer to the Turkish Penal Code for the difference in definitions. For instance, they state like that the distinction between serious assault and minor assault in the ICCS catalog is entirely based on the effect of the result of the act. In this respect, it is incompatible with the systematic in the Turkish Penal Code. And the last lesson that we learned from the final test, differences in definitions have also been identified for some acts of violence that have a counterpart in the ICCS. And it is thought that extra work should be done to ensure compliance with the ICVAC definitions. For instance, this description of level 1, in other words, homicide of children, description of its categories, and illustrator examples should consistent with ICCS or should prepare in line with ICCS such as femicide, attempted intentional homicide of a child, other acts leading to death of a child. You can see an error and can see our detailed comments from our Excel file as well. At the end of my speech, I would like to finish it with a very important quote of our nation's founder and great leader, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, for children. Children should be protected from all kinds of neglect and abuse, and they should be treated more privately or specifically than adults under any circumstances. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Salim, and thanks once again to Turkey, to the Statistical Institute, to yourself for your leadership and for volunteering to pilot the ICVAC. And we see right away some of the practical issues that have come out in implementing the ICVAC in specific national contexts. So let's move to our next panelist now. And we have Angela May from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. And Angela, good to see you. And we understand that you oversee the international classification of crime for statistical purposes. So what we'd like to know is how can ICVAC work together with these crime statistic systems to improve the availability and quality of data on violence that are also crimes. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Claudia, for first of all, for organizing this event and inviting us to be part of it, but also for the great effort that you have done, and particularly for the great collaboration that we have had, together to, respond as a UN system and really find a way that we can, together give the same message to those that want to improve statistics. So, as you said, where we stand here is only probably a partial, maybe one of the biggest, but partial source of information for violence against children. Not all violence against children in a way is recognized as a crime. And so crime statistics are only one of the elements that can describe and also where the classification, is applied. From our side, we have and has been mentioned many times, the international classification for crime for statistical purposes. And I have to say, and this has almost 20 years. So we have been working for almost 20 years with countries to see how the system of crime statistics can be made more relevant. And I wanted to focus on this because we statisticians love classifications. But we really made an effort to make sure that it's not just to count. So the ICCS mostly we consider it as an analytical tool in order to really not just count how many homicides, not just to count, and I think in the perspective of violence against children, just count how many children, but to have information that really help the authorities then to address it, to prevent it. And so, first of all, one of the big elements, and for us is important always to emphasize the S at the end. The classification is for statistical purposes. So it's not for legal analysis. And I want to respond, I saw some of the people in the chat that they were asking, well, so how can we change the crime code to apply the classification? That's not what the classification and the ICVAC also aims at. On the contrary, the classification tries to harmonize and to take any type of legal framework and translate the legal framework on what Claudia and we talk about acts. So we speak about a behavioral classification. And so in that sense, together, we promote the statistics that are based on behavioral terms and not criminal codes. Because we know that criminal codes would not change, should not change just for statistics. So it's the role of statistics to try to digest and understand how to take what is there in order to make it relevant for statistical purposes. So that definitely is something that we can work together and align to explain the role of classification. Then I wanted to say also the analytical purpose of the classification. And as Claudia mentioned, it's not just the elements that define what may be violence against children, but is also, and we find the most important part, at least of the ICCS, is that the variables that actually disaggregate, that, like, for example, to understand the typology of the perpetrator or of the victims. And in the ICCS, we have actually a broader level of what we call tag or the disaggregating variables, because these are the elements that help us to take the data and make it relevant for policy. And I'll give you just an example. For example, one of the things that we see is very important for us is the context. And I say it now in general for crime, but this is definitely very much relevant for children as well. So, and I take the homicide, the most extreme form of violence. And there are different types of homicide, and preventing the homicide requires different policies. Because one thing is we have an homicide that relates to organized crime. And so certain policy need to target specifically issue of organized crime. Another prevention measures are needed if, for example, this homicide happened in the family. So the importance to being able with the data to determine the context so that we know where we need the prevention, where we need really to target the action to prevent it. And this is true for children. There is, I would say, almost a generation of children that is lost in Central America, in part of Latin America with organized crime. And so it's important to determine it, to see it, where they are, who are the perpetrators. And another element, and I saw actually somebody in the chat also mentioned, said, how do we know if it's a gang member or if it is, another element that we have in the ICCS is cybercrime. There is so much nowadays, particularly on children and the violence against children in the cyberspace. And so important also to define that element, again, from, I'm always talking about the crime statistics. So in that sense, our efforts to help countries to improve refining the reporting of this information so that it will be relevant both for understanding violence against children and, understanding in general from our side all type of crime. So with that, I would say we really look forward to work together. And there are elements, many, that we can work together. We have now rolling out a serious manuals on to help police, to help criminal justice institution, prison institution, to align their work to the ICCS. So clearly, in rolling out these manuals and the manuals that you will produce, clearly we can go together and making sure that we align these efforts. One of the things that, at least from our side, is important, I would assume that at least partially is important also in the application of the ICVAC, is being able to compare data across criminal justice institutions. So that from the crime response point of view, is important also to understand not only, how big is the problem, but how does the criminal justice respond to it? And so how many actually then, if there is an incident of violence against children, how does that translate? What is the response? So how much goes to prosecution, to conviction, eventually to prison? And so this is definitely something that we are committed from our side, and definitely something that, as I said, since the two classifications are aligned, we clearly go together and make sure that we can support the countries, at least from my side, to improve their crime statistics system. And so we look forward to work with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you for sharing your love of classifications, but also highlighting the importance of analysis, because ultimately we need to use these to help authorities to respond and make these statistics relevant to policymakers. Next on the panel, we have Howard Taylor from the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. Hi, Howard. How can we make how can the ICVAC be used to drive government accountability and action to end violence against children?
Thanks, Stephen. And first, a huge thank you to you, to UNICEF, to the 200 experts and others involved in developing the ICVAC. This really is a huge development, a milestone moment for our collective global efforts to end violence against children. I don't think it can be underestimated just how important, how foundational this is. So a massive thank you to all of you involved. I studied some decades ago as a statistician and a demographer, and I feel both back among friends today, but I also feel slightly in awe of the collective expertise that is on this call this morning. I'm going to frame my comments briefly around how we can use the ICVAC to drive action, to drive accountability, and frame those comments broadly around two buckets. One is what gets measured gets done, and the other is that quality matters, that better data can and must drive action, investment, and accountability. First of all, what gets measured gets done. We're all probably familiar with that phrase. I think it was originally attributed to the management guru, Peter Drucker, who I think said what gets managed gets done. And I think in this sense with this data, it's not just what gets measured gets done, but what gets measured can get done well, because access to consistent, to accurate, to relevant data on violence against children is really critical to making and monitoring progress to end violence against children, but also to driving, to scaling up the critical investment that is needed in this space. As a community, this has been one of our toughest challenges, the paucity of data and the lack of investment in proven initiatives to tackle violence against children. Ending violence against children, as all on this call will know, is a complex multi-sectoral issue. Unlike some other more mature sectors, maybe health, education, very limited data on violence against children exists. And where it does exist, we know it hasn't been systematically collected, either within or across countries. So prevalence data at the national level on the many forms of violence against children and the evolving threat and risks to children is very sparse. And at the same time, while we know quite a lot, I sometimes say we know enough about what works to prevent and respond to violence against children. We do have the knowledge, the evidence, the solutions. There is a growing movement of individuals, of children, of organizations working together on this agenda. The lack of the available comparable data is a significant barrier. It's a barrier to evidence-based decision-making. It's a barrier to generating major political and financial commitments, and it's a barrier to holding governments accountable for the implementation of their commitments. So in short, if you don't measure something, if you can't measure it accurately, it usually doesn't feature as it should, whether that's in policies, in strategies, in national development plans, and in budget. So the endorsement of the ICVAC at the 54th session of the UN Statistical Commission a couple of months ago is a really important, really exciting foundational milestone and piece in our global efforts to tackle violence against children. Secondly, quality matters. Better data can and must drive action, investment, and accountability. We know that better data can and will inform strategic investment decisions by national governments who are desperate, frankly, to get the data that can show the return on investment of the solutions that we know can and do work. What are those investments, the prevention, the response interventions, and what is the return on those interventions so that they can more quickly support the scale up in the most cost-effective approaches. The End Violence Partnership a few years ago commissioned work from the World Bank on an investment case in tackling violence in schools, which made the case for investment. More recently, we've worked with many on this call and beyond on an investment case to tackle childhood sexual violence. On the former piece, the school piece, there was a reasonable amount of data that we could use, and that's why we ring-fenced that around ending violence in and through schools. On the latter, tackling childhood sexual violence, which is experienced by 1 in 8 people globally, there was a real paucity of evidence of the investment returns to the interventions which we and those experts in childhood sexual violence know enough about what works. And many conversations that I personally have had with governments and others around and donors across the world really bear out that we need to see the numbers. We need to know that this works, and then we can have a case to make internally within our governments to scale up the investment that's so needed. Better data also provides the basis for disaggregation on specific forms of violence against children. We've had other speakers touch on that, whether it's where violence happens at home, at school, online, in communities, whether it's physical, emotional, psychosocial, sexual violence, whether it's the gender dimensions, the demographic breakdown of violence against children. And of course, we heard also about the intersection between violence against women and girls and violence against children, because the disaggregation allows us to have appropriately targeted, tailored policies and programmatic interventions to tackle all of these different forms of violence and abuse of children. Major donors, whether it's governments, whether it's multilateral institutions, philanthropic foundations, the private sector, will invest and may only invest with greater confidence in the knowledge that they can be better placed to monitor and to evaluate the impact of their investments, which of course requires the data. The accountability point is really fundamental too, because better data will allow civil society, will equip civil society to better undertake more effective advocacy and campaign efforts around government accountability. And it will improve that government accountability, the impact of government efforts, which can be better monitored and reported, whether that's through sustainable development goal channels or child rights processes, such as the voluntary national reporting process. And then greater comparability of statistics among countries will both enhance accountability, I think, across countries and internationally, and drive national action, but also will inform learnings and the sharing of learnings between effective policies on effective policies and programs, which can then be more easily shared between countries if we can get more and more quantifiable and not just qualifiable evidence and data. And that's something which we know the pathfinding governments, the 38 pathfinding governments within the End Violence Partnership really value, is that lesson learning. So just in closing to say, to reinforce a big thank you to UNICEF for leading this process and inspiring this process with all of the experts involved. We can and we must be deliberate in bringing this to life. And I think the must is really important. This is going to take deliberate effort from all of us. We all have a part to play, whether it's globally, regionally, nationally, or locally, in sharing, promoting, refining, using this statistical classification and the related tools that are being developed and the capacity development that is so vital, all of which is foundational component in our collective efforts to catalyze the vital leadership commitments, to make the case for investments, to inform the policies and programs, and all of which will accelerate progress to end violence against children so that every child, wherever they live, can grow up in a safe, secure, and nurturing environment. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Howard. Those are really powerful points. What measures gets done, and we all know, data on violence against children has just been so limited. And I really think that has, undermined efforts to attack it in a concerted way, and that quality mattered as well. That for investments, we need to make sure that they're targeted appropriately for prevention response and for monitoring and evaluation. Thanks again, Howard. Now we'll turn back to Claudia, who has been reviewing the Q&A. And I'm sure she's picked out the most difficult, complex, and challenging questions to tackle in the next few minutes.
Indeed, Stephen. And of course, I'm really grateful for the question you raised. And hopefully, once you receive the publication, and again, I just want to remind everybody, you will receive on Monday the recording of the webinar, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as the actual International Classification of Violence Against Children, and the link to the webpage where you will find all relevant material. But I noticed some of the questions in the chat, and I want to take a moment to just unpack a couple of things that cut across the different questions. Because we chose to classify the act as the unit of the international classification, This has been really the turning point. We are not looking at the motivation. We are not consider whether the act intended to produce harm. This is irrelevant. If an act is harmful, no matter who did it, and no matter the intention of the person who did it, whether the intention was to harm or not, an act is classified as an act of violence. So let me take a very straightforward example. A slap is a slap. A slap is fulfill the 4 concurrent criteria. It's harmful, yes. Even if committed by a parent, even if the intention of the parent is not to harm the child. Is the slap of a child in the context of discipline essential? It is not, because essential is defined as essential for the survival or fitness of the child. Essential means there are no alternative to preserve the life or well-being of the child. A slap is not essential. There are positive parenting practices that have proved to be effective in disciplining children in a positive and empowering way. And this is exactly why we try to eliminate all reference to legal terminology and references, for instance, to issues that can be differently interpreted depending on culture, religion, etc. The second point I want to mention is that this classification is the backbone through which statistical data can be produced. But these are not data in itself. The statistical classification, you will not find statistics. It's a way through which we can organize the different forms of violence and then identify the key criteria that allow through, of course, data collection that will have to happen through questionnaire and other forms for an act to be identified as an act of violence. And again, regardless of legislation, regardless of cultural belief. And it does, again, looking at some of the questions you have, regulate acts of violence that occur in different settings, in war context, in non-conflict situation, regardless who perpetrate. But of course, the moment then we, in addition to identifying the act, we collect this additional variable on who did it, when it was done, etc. This will allow to add context that allow users to understand how this violence occur, who did it, etc. So this is just some of the answer through your questions. And of course, please feel free to continue to ask the questions even going forward. You will receive the email with our contact information. We need these type of questions because these type of questions allow us not only to clarify where the ICVAC stands, but also to work towards implementation at the country level, because we need to get this clarity together to be able to successfully implement the ICVAC. Now, without further ado, and acknowledging that indeed there were more questions in the chat that we will try to address in typing, I want to give the floor to João Pedro Azevedo, which I introduced earlier, but again is the Chief Statistician of UNICEF. It's our pleasure to have João Pedro joining UNICEF this year. And over to you, João Pedro, for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you very much, colleagues. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Excellent. So first of all, I'm very pleased to have all you here and to be able to join you today in this webinar on the International Classification of Violence Against Children. UNICEF worked to build a world where children reach their full potential, growing up healthy, educated, and protected from violence in all its forms is unstoppable. Data is a critical element of this work. And to make the violence against children more visible is a critical part of what we are here today gathered for. An international classification of violence against children marks a turning point in the generation of such data. At the international level, the ICVAC will enhance the comparability of statistics among countries at the national level, as well as the international. ICVAC offers a model to organize statistical data on violence against children across different data sources. And as many of the panelists have said, it also offers an analytical framework on what to do about this problem, which is the most important element of this conversation. International classifications reflect a shared understanding across multiple stakeholders around an issue, in this case, violence against children. This is only possible thanks to the technical and political commitment of these actors around this topic. This work is only starting, and next week, the work to magnify this shared understanding within countries, among politicians, policymakers, and civil society will begin. Only through a broad understanding and a coalition at the country level, we will be able to see action on the ground and improve the life of every child wherever they are. We are very grateful to many partners who have worked with us over the past few years to achieve this milestone, and we look forward to continue the collaboration to support ICVAC uptake. Furthermore, UNICEF has just launched the 7th round of the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey Program, or the MIX. The MIX is the largest source of internationally comparable data on certain forms of violence against children, such as violence discipline and female genital mutilation. I'm pleased to announce that the new module of violence against children and women, built on the ICVAC definition, will become part of the MIX, including a module on childhood sexual abuse and one building on domestic violence. These modules are available not only to be implemented through the MIX, but through any other existing household survey program, and we'll be happy to support countries in this endeavor. With this classification, we now have standards and an analytical framework with which data gaps can be filled and accountability fostered and policies designed. Let us use it to lay the solid foundation from which to build a world where all children are safe and free from violence in all its forms. Thank you very much. And now I pass the floor to Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JP. We come to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much again for attending. It was beautiful to see among you all newcomers, as well as those who really were part of the drafting team. So again, thank you very much. And now to close, I want to leave you, and hopefully the technology will be on our side. I want to leave you with a short 2-minute video that we produced to summarize what this classification is about. So let's now enjoy the video. And again, on behalf of UNICEF, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to continuing the collaboration. Thank you.
Violence against children exists in every culture. It takes many forms, from rape to psychological neglect and physical assault. Children subjected to violence can face acute and long-term damage to their physical, cognitive, social, and emotional development. And the costs to society are incalculable. In 2015, with the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals, the world committed to ending violence against children in all its forms by 2030. However, while the goal is straightforward, monitoring it is anything but. Collecting high-quality data on children's experience of violence in a comprehensive and ethically safe manner is challenging. It is further complicated by the different notions of violence used among and even within countries. To fill data gaps, clear-cut operational definitions first had to be developed. UNICEF has done just that. Over 5 years, and in consultation with more than 200 experts, UNICEF developed the International Classification of Violence Against Children. The ICVAC was endorsed by the United Nations Statistical Commission in March 2023. It provides a comprehensive definition of violence and categorizes violent acts for statistical purposes. It offers a basis for countries to gather comparable data through household surveys and administrative data systems. The ultimate goal? To foster the production of timely and accurate data that can encourage action and accountability by governments and other stakeholders. Violence against children is a violation of their basic human rights. Defining and measuring such violence is a critical first step towards ending it.